Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of the functional analysis lecture, functional assessment lecture on chapter 13. So this is the third video on this chapter. I should conclude today. I have included a lot of resources for you in terms of articles and other YouTube videos, and I'll talk about them throughout the lecture today. And I'll also be sending an announcement regarding lecture, exams, when I've been sending announcements when I'm posting the videos on YouTube. So make sure you have the Canvas app on your phone and you have the notifications on. So when there is a notification on Canvas, you're getting that on your phone as well. For those of you who subscribe to the YouTube channel, then you should also see the video when the video is posted, when you turn your YouTube on or when you open your YouTube app. You should see that a new video got posted there. I'm trying to post the videos a few hours before the scheduled lecture. I know some of you might be watching the video during the regular scheduled class, and some of you are using the opportunity that the video is on YouTube to go back, rewatch it, or watch it late at night when you get home from work or at different times. Again, I know that some of you with children might be quite overwhelmed and you might not be able to watch the videos during the scheduled time, but you may after your kids go to bed or before your kids wake up early in the morning. Hopefully, again, the video is working out for you. Thank you so much for those of you who posted some feedback on the discussion board. It's really nice to see that some of you are watching the videos and enjoying it. If there's anything you want me to do differently or improve upon, please give me feedback. I'm really trying to, adapt to this new online system the best way that I can. I'm not super technologically savvy. I know a lot of faculty are using software to edit their lectures and maybe make it a little fancier. Which is, it might be good because if I start coughing or if my phone rings in the middle of the lecture, then I can't really edit that out. You're going to be seeing, this sort of a live recording in many ways of the lecture. There are no edits here. So I'm just improvising as I go, like I would do if I were teaching live. So I want this to be as close to what lecture would look like as possible. Of course, if you were in the classroom, you would be able to ask me some questions live. But I might have a few sessions of the class live via Zoom. I'll announce that maybe closer to the exam. I may schedule one of the lectures during the class time live. So those of you who are interested in joining it live, you would be able to. I would still record it. So if you cannot join live, you can watch the video later. So I'll be announcing that later. So make sure you pay attention to the Canvas announcements. I'm also going to be removing the paper requirement for the class. So there's a paper that you're supposed to write and turn in during finals week. Everyone is overwhelmed with everything that's been going on. So I'm going to try to make things a little easier for you, and I'm going to remove the requirement. Again, I will update the syllabus, and I'll be sending an announcement about that. One of the advantages of going online is that I might be able to finish the unit sooner. Therefore, I can create, like I did last time, some online activity in which you can practice some multiple choice questions, and then you can get some activity points for that. So I might have some additional quote unquote in-class activities, which will involve some Canvas assignments that would generate some of the points that you would be getting had I kept the final paper requirement. So I will remove the final paper requirement. I know some of you emailed me about that. Lastly, I had online office hours last Monday, and I noticed that some of you joined in and you were on the waiting list for the Zoom meeting. And then by the time I finished with the first student and I went in, some of the folks that were on the waiting list had left. So please be patient. I'll try to keep the appointments uh, to last about 10 minutes. And then I'll be able to get to you. If for some reason you're waiting too long and you decide, I can't do this, shoot me an email and maybe we can schedule a specific time for you to join the Zoom meeting, or we can schedule a meeting at a different time. Hopefully this works for you guys. Sorry, I'm going to be coughing a little today because my allergies are really acting up. My throat's very dry. Okay, so the last thing that we talked about was the functional analysis, right? So the experimental functional analysis, remember, is really when we arrange the environment to simulate the variables that would be controlling the behavior in the natural environment. So we simulate those variables in an analog environment. So this is an example, the one that I gave last video, of a functional analysis in which the conditions are being alternated in a multi-element design. We talked about multi-element designs in chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken, right, on graphing behavior. Maybe 3, maybe it's chapter 3. I'm not 100% sure here. You can go back and take a look in your book. And here you have the conditions alternating. As you can see, the first condition is the condition in which the individual is being brought into the clinic and essentially being observed for 10 minutes alone. And why is the individual left alone and the behavior is being observed during this condition? This is to see if for some reason the behavior can occur in the absence of social consequences. If that's the case, then you would assume that, well, the behavior is probably maintained by automatic reinforcement, right? So automatic reinforcement is what maintains behavior. Behavior doesn't need any social mediation, doesn't need the reinforcement from others. The next condition is a condition, as you can see, the square is a condition in which if the behavior occurs, it produces attention. So what kind of attention? Let's imagine this is some sort of a repetitive behavior. Individual engages in some sort of motor repetition. Some people may say, stop doing that in the natural environment, right? I mean, stop doing it. Or if maybe some sort of aggression, the parent may yell at the kid. So in this case, it would be essentially the same. We would try to simulate that. So it would say, stop doing it. You're hurting someone, you're hurting your brother, or something like that. And that could be in the natural environment a form of reinforcement, right? Problem behavior may occur when the individual is deprived of attention because it produces some sort of social mediation, right? So in this condition, what we would have is we would have the individual, the therapist not provide any attention to the individual. And then what would happen is that individual would engage in the problem behavior, and then attention will be delivered, right? And then same thing would happen. The therapist will move away, no attention to the client. If the client engages in the problem behavior, then attention is delivered and so forth. And then, of course, problem behavior is being measured. Now notice that here problem behavior occurred about twice per minute in the session during the 10-minute session. The next condition is the play condition. That is the control condition. So this is the condition when everything is available. So there should be no motivation for the behavior to occur. Client is playing with toys. So there shouldn't be a reason for the client to engage in problem behavior to get toys. Client is getting non-contingent attention. So the therapist is delivering attention to the client, non-contingent to problem behavior. So not immediately after problem behavior, just on a fixed time schedule, like, hey, nice job playing with your toys. So no reason for the client to engage in problem behavior to obtain attention. Then you get, so toys are being delivered, attention is being delivered, and no demands whatsoever. So no motivation to remove demands, right? So And this is important because if in this case here, as you can see, behavior occurs very little in this condition. I mean, it occurs less in the alone condition, but in this condition is not occurring that much. So you see about one response per minute. Um, the next condition is a condition in which you see the behavior occur more often, and that is the demand condition. So the demand condition here is the individual is placed in this analog setting, 10-minute session, and during this testing session, what happens is a demand that is slightly aversive is placed on the participant, and if the participant engages in the problem behavior, then the demand is removed, right? So if the behavior is being maintained by negative reinforcement, you should be an increase in behavior under this testing condition, under this test condition. So here you can see behavior does increase. And as compared to a condition in which demands are not being placed, which is the control condition, you see there's a pretty clear differentiation. You notice that those cycles get repeated, right? So you went from the first session being an alone, and then immediately after was an attention, and then it was a play, and then it was a demand, and then again an alone condition, and so forth. And those sessions are being repeated so you can actually see a pattern of responding. Pretty clear pattern here. You see a trend that is pretty stable when it comes to behavior under all these conditions. Behavior, there's not a lot of variation here. Pretty clear high levels of behavior during the demand condition and much lower levels of behavior in the other conditions, suggesting here that the behavior can be turned on. It occurs when you arrange the environment with some demands, and then problem behavior produces removal of demands, but all the other conditions do not produce behavior. Therefore, you would say the behavior in this case is a function of negative reinforcement. And again, that's likely what is maintaining the behavior in the natural environment. So you did this in the analog setting in your clinic, and that's likely what's maintaining behavior in the natural environment. Very well. Let's look at a different graph. So this one is a graph that you have a different result. So as you can see, several cycles of all the tests. Here you start with the demand condition, and the next session, I think it is an attention condition. So sorry, demand condition, then an attention condition, then an alone condition, then a control or play condition, and then it goes back to attention, demand, alone, play, several cycles of all these 4 tests. And you see pretty clear stability here. You see some dip in behavior, but then it kind of goes back. So it stays at around 20 to almost 40 percent of the 10-second intervals in which the behavior is being observed. So the behavior, maybe the behavior is being observed on a partial interval or whole interval. And then here the behavior occurs at about, probably on average 30% of the intervals. And the behavior doesn't occur at all in the play condition, very little. It did occur a little bit in the beginning, in the first few testing sessions of the alone condition, right? But then as the participant did not contact any reinforcement during that condition, behavior went away, but behavior stayed at a pretty high rate during the attention condition, suggesting that, again, when the behavior occurred in these conditions, it produced reinforcement from the experimenter or the therapist in the form of attention, suggesting, again, that this behavior is maintained by positive social reinforcement in the form of attention. So any treatment would deal with teaching potentially an alternative response that would produce attention, putting the problem behavior under extinction, so not delivering attention contingent upon problem behavior, or delivering attention non-contingent. So all these are possible treatments. We will talk about treatments and how we match the treatment to the function determined by the functional assessment in our subsequent lectures. Now, I pulled some functional analysis graphs from this article that was published by Dr. Tim Vollmer, who is currently a professor at the University of Florida. At the time, he was a professor at Louisiana State University. So it's an old article, but I think it has some interesting examples of functional analysis data that were, in some cases, undifferentiated. I'll be posting this article in case you're interested in understanding what they've done when the data were undifferentiated. So let me give you some examples here. So this is some of the operational definitions that they include in that article. And so you can see these are the behaviors that they were dealing with. They had individuals with different kinds of disabilities and different ages. And then you have the behaviors on the left, the labels, and the definitions on the right. So this was what they were collecting data or targeting in these functional analysis. So they're trying to understand the reason for why these behaviors were occurring so they could create a treatment that would address the function or the causes of the behavior. So this is an example of Robert. Robert is a 3.5-year-old boy with developmental disabilities, and the behavior here that is being observed is aggression as defined in the previous slide. So here you see the first cycle of testing conditions. You see the first condition, the square, is a positive reinforcement condition, but here is in the form of a tangible. So why did they design this condition? Well, they may have designed this condition because when they interview parents or when they did some descriptive assessment, when they did some observations, they've noticed that Robert would maybe engage in problem behavior when a preferred item was taken away, or when he didn't have access to a preferred item. And then, of course, when problem behavior occurred, it would, in some occasions, produce the item. So maybe Robert, punches people, and then he can get whatever he wants by punching people. So then you would suggest that maybe behavior is occurring. It's a way for Robert to get what he wants. So let's create a condition in which when he engages in the problem behavior, he gets what he wants, and that's then called the positive reinforcement condition in the form of tangible. The next condition, which is the closed circle, is the no interaction condition, which is similar to the alone condition or control condition, or sorry, not the control condition. It's similar to the alone condition that I talked about in the previous slide. Why is it called no interaction here? Because in some situations, when you're trying to evaluate whether behavior is maintained by its sensory products or whether it's maintained by automatic reinforcement, you may put the individual in a situation where he or she is alone to see if the behavior would persist under those circumstances. So meaning, does the behavior occur in the absence of any social reinforcement? And if so, if behavior is sustained under those conditions, you would assume the behavior produces its own reinforcement, is automatic. Now, sometimes we cannot leave the individual alone for a variety of reasons, for safety reasons usually. Therefore, we create a condition where there's someone in the room, but that person is not interacting with the individual. And that's to rule out the possibility that the behavior is occurring to produce some sort of attention as a reinforcement. So no interaction means the experimenter or the therapist is there, but not interacting, ignoring the individual, and then make sure that if the behavior occurs that is sustained in a situation in which there are absolutely no interactions, then you could assume the behavior is maintained by its sensory products. It's not ideal because you have someone there, and having someone there could serve as a discriminative stimulus for attention. So someone might engage in problem behavior for attention if there's someone there. But over time, the individual learns that under those circumstances, there will be no interaction. So exposing the participant to that condition would aid in the discrimination of the condition. The next condition, as you can see, is another positive reinforcement condition, but here, instead of tangible, if the problem behavior occurs, it produces attention, right? So maybe aggression, someone would say, again, like in the previous example, stop doing this. The next condition is the play or the control condition. That's the chill condition. Um, Participant has access to toys. Participant has no demands, is getting attention contingently. You shouldn't see behavior occur at the time. And that's the case. You don't see behavior occur in the control condition in this first cycle of tests. So four testing sessions are conducted, or 5 testing sessions are conducted. There's one more. There's the negative reinforcement condition, which appears next, right? Which is the triangle. So you see another cycle here. Then you have all the conditions. The negative reinforcement condition is the demand condition that I talked about last. So as you can see, you see a decreasing trend here. So the first cycle would suggest that maybe attention or tangible is the reinforcer. But then in the next cycle, you don't see a lot of problem behavior in the tangible condition. You see some behavior in the negative reinforcement or demand condition. They keep running cycles, and you actually see less behavior during the tangible condition. So as a behavior analyst, I wouldn't be quite sure what's maintaining the behavior here, but like, it seemed in the beginning that there was a lot of behavior occurring during the attention condition compared to the other conditions, but I'm not seeing that. So let's keep running the assessment and see what happens. As the assessment is being run, so stop here, you see still no differentiation, but because the behavior did occur in the tangible condition a little bit more than in the other conditions, let's run just some tangible conditions for a while and see what happens. And as you can see, as you repeat the tangible condition, you see the problem behavior emerging in that condition. You see an increase of behavior under those circumstances, leading you to conclude that problem behavior is occurring because of a tangible, positive social reinforcement. So this is an example in which they extended or exposed the participant to this testing condition a few times to see if there would be, if you see some function emerging. It's another condition here, as you can see, pretty differentiated. So you have Kevin. It's a 1.5-year-old child with intellectual disability, and the problem behavior here is head hitting. So same conditions that you saw before. This is also an example in which if just a few sessions have been conducted, you wouldn't really see a pattern emerging. But as testing conditions are being implemented, eventually you see pretty clear differentiation between the demand condition or the negative reinforcement condition here and the control conditions and the other conditions. So very little behavior in the other conditions, and you see a lot of behavior in the last 3 testing sessions of negative reinforcement. Then you have another example here of an undifferentiated one. So this is the kind of functional analysis that will not help you very much, right? So here's Corey, 3-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, and the problem behaviors being observed that covariate likely are head banging, ear poking, face hitting. And as you can see, the conditions are being alternated, and you see pretty stable levels of problem behavior across all conditions, leading you to conclude that, well, I don't know what's maintaining the behavior. Now, if you think about this, what are the possible options? Like, why is it the behavior occurring in all conditions? So think about, what would you answer if I had asked that in class? So some students would answer, well, is it possible that the behavior is maintained or is reinforced by a variety of different things? Maybe sometimes the behavior occurs for attention. Sometimes the behavior occurs to eliminate a demand, or the behavior has been reinforced in the past in the presence of demands because it produced demand removal. Maybe behavior also occurs in conditions in which the client is deprived of attention because in the past, the problem behavior has produced the removal of attention. Maybe there is some automatic reinforcement function with the behavior. So, hey, Dr. Miguel, I think the behavior could be multiply controlled, which means you would have to design an intervention that addresses all functions. Well, that's a possibility. Another possibility that someone may come up with is to say, well, maybe behavior is automatically reinforced. And then my question will be, well, if the behavior is automatically reinforced, shouldn't it occur only in the alone condition? And then your answer, and some of you might come up with this answer, you would say, well, if the behavior is maintained by its own sensory product, well, it would produce automatic reinforcement. It would produce its own sensory product regardless of the conditions, right? So this is head banging. So imagine that Corey engages in head banging because of the sensation it produces, right? For some reason, Corey, maybe has some sort of sensory deprivation, doesn't have a lot of skills, doesn't produce a lot of stimulation in his or her environment, or maybe lives in a very impoverished environment in terms of stimulation. So he bangs his head and that produces this sensation. So he produces his own stimulation and that's what maintains the problem behavior. Well, when he's in the alone condition, he can do that and he would produce the reinforcer. When he's in the demand condition, when the therapist is presenting a demand, he's going to engage that because it produces automatic reinforcement. If he's in the attention condition, he's going to do that because that's going to produce the sensation. The sensation will be produced in all conditions. So therefore, well, the behavior, if it's automatically reinforced, it could occur in every single condition. And if you answer that, that's also a pretty good hypothesis. But how can you confirm that hypothesis? Well, this is what they did. They got Corey, and then after they finished the multi-element design, which was undifferentiated, which is the data that I just showed in the previous slide, they had an extended no interaction condition. So if Corey is left alone or the therapist is not interacting with him, would behavior be sustained? Because if the behavior is maintained by social reinforcement, by not delivering any reinforcement, then the behavior should undergo extinction, right? So if the behavior is maintained by either positive or negative reinforcement, then by not interacting with Corey, behavior should decline. But does behavior decline here? What do you see? It doesn't. Behavior is sustained in situations in which no interaction, no reinforcement is being provided. Again, verifying that behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. So the hypothesis that behavior was occurring in all conditions because it produces sensory stimulation is verified in the second condition, right? So this extended no interaction condition suggests that behavior occurs regardless of any interactions, meaning that the behavior is maintained by its own sensory product. Hopefully this makes sense. If it doesn't, rewind. That's the advantage of the video, right? If I'm lecturing class and you miss something, oh well. But here you can just rewind and rewatch my explanation. Here's another example, guy, and again, pretty undifferentiated. I don't see any patterns here. I have no idea why the behavior is occurring. And here, what they do is they do a reversal. So they isolate the conditions. So, okay, let's present the no interaction condition like we did for Corey. So is it that behavior would occur when there is no interaction? No, it doesn't. See, the behavior doesn't occur when there's no reinforcement. So that leads me to believe that, okay, the behavior, then we can rule out the possibility that the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement or some form of sensory stimulation, because when there's no one around interacting with Guy, his behavior doesn't occur. So it's not automatic reinforcement. How about negative reinforcement in the form of demand? If we present demands and then he engages in problem behavior, when we reduce the demands, do we see an increase in problem behavior? Well, you see an increase here as compared to the alone condition, at least, right? So not a lot here. You see an increase here. Okay, let's put another condition in place, the play condition, the control condition, where toys are available, attention is available, no demands are present. This is the condition in which problem behavior should not occur, unless, of course, it's automatically reinforced, then it might occur in this condition. So as you can see, it doesn't occur. Great, that's good. We have pretty good control. Now let's put the condition in which there is positive reinforcement in the form of tangible. So again, problem behavior occurs, and then guy gets to play with the toy that he wants. You see a little bit of behavior, but not as much as compared to negative reinforcement or demand, which, you know, the experimenter here is probably thinking, that's probably what's maintaining the behavior. Let's replicate it. Let's implement this condition again. And they do it. And as you can see, behavior increases under those circumstances, but not the other. You could replicate if you wanted some other conditions, and they do the attention condition here, which was the last one, right? They hadn't done it separately yet. You could replicate the other conditions if you wanted, but it seems like this is the function of the behavior. So any treatment would address a negative reinforcement function in the form of escape. So in this case, if he's engaging, I forgot what was the behavior for Guy. I think I didn't write it down. So let's say it was aggression. If he was engaging in aggression to escape demands, then any intervention here then might involve teaching him a different skill to remove demands, making demands a little easier for him, so there is no reason for him to engage in problem behavior, and then probably associated with some sort of extinction of negative reinforcement, right? So the treatment will be tailored to the individual because it is based on the function of the behavior, right? So Guy might be engaging in aggression to produce escape from tasks. So the treatment will be based on that function, but another child may be engaging in aggression to produce attention. So the treatment would then be, of course, different for that child. This is another article that I think it's interesting because it talks about antecedent versus consequence events as predictors of problem behavior. Remember when I talked about descriptive assessment, and I told you a little bit about ABC data collection, in which you're taking data on the antecedents and the consequences for the behavior. You can do a narrative form, or you can do a structure form, and then you calculate some probabilities, right? To see, what's the probability that certain antecedents are present when the problem behavior occurs? What are some probabilities that certain consequences are present when the problem behavior occurs? And that gives you, or gets you to generate a hypothesis. So the question, I told you that, descriptive assessments may not be as accurate as functional analysis, as experimental functional analysis, because of course, you're creating a hypothesis with the functional assessment is a correlation. You see increases in behavior and increases in certain antecedents correlated with problem behavior, and certain consequences correlated with problem behavior. But an experimental functional analysis, you're turning the behavior on and off. You have an independent variable, which is the presentation of antecedent events like lack of attention and delivery of attention. So the presentation of consequent events, and then you're manipulating those antecedent and consequences and seeing the differences in behavior. So you actually have a functional relation between independent and dependent variable. That's why we call it experimental functional analysis. So that's why that's the most accurate strategy to produce to identify the function of behavior. Now, in this study, they actually compared descriptive the predictability of descriptive assessments when it comes to the function of behavior. And so they calculated what I talked to you guys about earlier, the conditional probability of an antecedent. So they took data on the antecedents and consequences. So every time problem behavior occurred, they took data on like what was happening when the problem behavior occurred, which was the antecedent, and what followed the problem behavior, right? So what do you do with this data? You collect a bunch of this data. Some of you might be RBTs, or some of you may work in the field of behavior analysis with clients with disabilities, and you take data, you take ABC data. So you write down when the problem behavior occurs, what was happening when the problem behavior occurred, and then of course, what happens after the problem behavior occurred. So what kind of consequence was delivered. So in this case, you get this information and you calculate this thing called conditional probability. So the conditional probability of the antecedent events here is that conditional probability of an antecedent event given problem behavior, in this case, is calculated by dividing the number of intervals during which a specific antecedent event preceded problem behavior. So when a specific event occur prior to problem behavior, so let's say lack of attention, so the number of times lack of attention occurred, by the total number of intervals with the problem behavior, right? So if the problem behaviors, in this case, there's an example here. If problem behavior occurred in 5 intervals and no attention was available prior to problem behavior on 2 occasions, then you'll be 2 divided by 5, which will give you 0.4, right? So in this case, 0.4 is the probability, the conditional probability of that antecedent preceding problem behavior. And then you do the same thing for the consequences. So the conditional probability in this case of a consequence event given problem behavior is calculated by dividing the number of intervals during which a specific consequence event follow problem behavior by the total number of intervals with the problem behavior. So in this case, if problem behavior occurred, again, 5 intervals and it was followed by attention 3 times, then the conditional probability would be 3 divided by 5, which would be 0.6. So that gives you an idea of the probability, right, in which certain antecedent and consequence events. So let's look at this client, Jerry, 19-year-old individual with intellectual disabilities, and the problem behavior here is hand biting. When the top panel has the conditional probability for the antecedent events and the bottom panel for the consequent events. What I really want you to pay attention is the conditional probability, which is the dashed bars. The white bars, I don't want you to pay, you don't need to pay attention to. That's the proportion of intervals in which the event occurred regardless of the problem behavior, and then they call that the unconditional probability. So it's important to know this when reading the paper, but for now, let's see what the conditional probability will be telling us about the behavior. So on the top, antecedent events, notice that if the behavior occurred 5 times and the antecedent, and it was preceded by a specific antecedent 5 times, so you have 5 occurrences of the behavior, 5 times 5 divided by 5 is 1. So if every time the behavior occurred, it was preceded by a certain event, the probability would be 1, which you could also say that if you wanted to, you could say 100% of the time that behavior occurred, this antecedent preceded the problem behavior. So in this case, notice that no attention or lack of attention preceded, the probability here was 0.9, right? So that's pretty high probability, which would suggest that, well, if the behavior is occurring a lot when there is no attention, then maybe the behavior is maintained by attention, right? So no attention is a motivating operation that might increase attention as a reinforcer. So maybe Jerry is engaging in problem behavior to get attention, because when he doesn't have any, he's engaging the problem behavior. No problem behavior, no conditional probability outcomes when the demand is calculated or with the demand as an antecedent. And you see about almost 0.6 with no tangible. So again, when Jerry doesn't have access to an item that he wants, or when an item is taken away, there is a 0.6 probability that problem behavior would occur. Or in this case, 0.6 probability that this antecedent condition, no tangible, preceded problem behavior, and a little bit alone. So here, if you just look at the antecedents, if you only look at the top panel, you could say, well, my conditional probability when we're looking at antecedents might be suggesting that the behavior is maintained by positive social reinforcement in the form of attention or tangible, right? Now let's look at the consequences. The consequences, no conditional probability, no probability that attention follow problem behavior or demand, and even tangible, just a point to. So that might tell me like, well, behavior may be occurring regardless of all those consequences. So maybe a negative an automatic reinforcement condition. So I don't know, this ABC data, this conditional probability, it's not giving me that much information, is it? So, maybe positive reinforcement, either in the form of attention or tangible, maybe based on the antecedent conditional probability. And then a functional analysis is conducted. Now look at the functional analysis, and as you can see, there's a pretty clear emergence of problem behavior under conditions in which a demand is presented, and the problem behavior removes the demand. So actually, here you have the function of behavior being determined to be negative social reinforcement in the form of escape. Now, that was not predicted at all, right? Look, nothing in the demand data here, nothing. So didn't really predict, didn't really give you information. The descriptive assessment didn't really give you information here on the function of the behavior, and whatever information it gave you was pretty inaccurate or not, didn't predict the outcomes of the functional analysis at all. And in that specific study, only 4 out of the 7 cases there was a correspondence between the descriptive assessment and the functional analysis, right? So clear, the functional analysis is the accurate or the way to go when it comes to functional assessment. Now, of course, I told you about the different functional assessments that we have, the informant assessment, descriptive assessments that involve those observations like ABC, and then the functional analysis, which is an actual experiment in which you manipulate the independent variables to see the effects that it has on behavior, so you can actually know for certain what the function of the behavior is. Once you identify the function of behavior, you're going to want to design a treatment. And we're going to be talking about treatments in the next few lectures. So the next few units in this course will be about treatment. So what you're going to do is, based on the information you have on your functional assessment, you're going to develop a treatment and then implement the treatment. So again, the function of the behavior is hypothesized to be the reinforcer. So, meaning the consequence that increases the future occurrence of the behavior. So that's what you're going to manipulate in your treatment. Typically, as you see in the subsequent lectures, the treatment involves some form of extinction paired with another type of treatment, usually a differential reinforcement, an antecedent manipulation, and so forth. Then you're going to evaluate the treatment. So you're still collecting data to make sure that the treatment is actually working. And is the treatment effective? Meaning, is the problem behavior decreasing and desirable behaviors increasing? That's why it's so important for us to keep collecting data. Yes, great. Then how do we make sure that the treatment can be carried on in different environments, that it was going to be long-lasting, that it can occur in the presence of different individuals, different settings, and so forth. So we're going to promote maintenance and generalization. And then if the treatment is not effective, so if you're taking data and behavior is not going away, and appropriate behavior, problem behavior is not going away, and appropriate behavior is not increasing, then what went wrong? So if the treatment was not effective, and then you're going to ask, well, was it implemented correctly? If yes, then, then maybe we identified the wrong function. Maybe we thought that the behavior is maintained by attention. We remove attention, gave the individual another opportunity, a different way to produce attention. But, well, that's not the function of the behavior. Maybe our assessment yield inaccurate results, so we need to conduct another functional assessment to make sure that we actually got the correct function, that we're not designing a treatment that is not addressing the real reason for why the behavior is occurring. If, however, your functional assessment has yielded perfect, accurate data, then maybe the treatment is the correct treatment, it's just being implemented poorly. So that might be an issue of fidelity or integrity of the treatment. So you need to train the folks that are implementing the treatment. You need to observe, make sure the treatment is being implemented with fidelity and so forth. Treatment implementation or treatment fidelity or treatment integrity is a big area of research and behavior analysis now. Dr. Dennis Brand, who's a professor here in the department, has been studying treatment integrity a lot. And that has to do with the fact that a lot of times people design effective interventions, but behavior is not changing because those that are responsible for implementing the treatment are not doing it with the highest integrity. So they're missing a lot of steps, not doing things correctly, and then you have to figure out why they're not doing things correctly, then train them to do it correctly. So a lot of these studies are related to staff training, making sure that staff are well trained and their behavior is maintained. They continue implementing the procedures accurately, right? So they're not just like implementing the procedures correctly after they get trained, but then over time you see their performance getting worse and errors occurring, and that would impact on the client who's not receiving the most accurate treatment. Really interesting stuff. If you're interested in staff training, Dr. Brand is a perfect person to go talk to. He's doing a lot of cool stuff. He's a new faculty member, so he's been establishing his lab. A lot of opportunities for research with him if you're interested in staff training. And then, of course, you make the changes as needed throughout the implementation of your procedure. So overall, in summary, you begin with an interview or other indirect informant assessment methods to get an idea when the behavior is occurring, the presence of whom, what kind of behavior are we dealing with, so you can come up with an operational definition, your data collection system, and so forth. Then you can develop on a hypothesis about the antecedents and consequences. You would then go observe the behavior based on your hypothesis to take some additional data. You can confirm or modify your original hypothesis based on those observations. If the assessments are consistent, if it's a pretty clear function, you can just develop and implement treatment. If not, then you would want to run an experimental functional analysis, because again, that's really the most accurate way to come up with a function of the behavior. If you cannot conduct some functional analysis, then the reasons why it may be impossible to do so, you may want to then conduct further functional assessment, get additional information to verify that your hypothesis is correct. Now, I took this from the board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. And here is one of the sections in which they talk about behavior assessment. So as you can see in the first paragraph, behavior analysts conduct current assessments prior to making recommendations or developing behavior change programs. The type of assessment used is determined by clients' needs and consent, environmental parameters, and other contextual variables. When behavior analysts are developing a behavior reduction program, they must first conduct a functional assessment, and that's usually the case in schools as well. If a child is going to receive any behavior intervention plan, school psychologists would first run a functional assessment to determine the function of behavior before coming up with a behavior intervention plan. And behavior analysts have an obligation to collect and graphically display data using behavior analytic conventions in a manner that allows for decisions and recommendations for behavior change program development. So here is in our ethical code. In terms of what needs to be done, right? So we must identify the function of behavior before we come up with a treatment. In 2016, a colleague of mine, Eileen Roscoe, who is director of research and one of the largest, coolest research treatment facilities for autism in the world, called the New England Center for Children. If you don't know anything about them, you should go check them out. Look at least their website. And if you are in Massachusetts, in the Boston area, you should go try to tour the facility. So in that survey, she sent a survey to, in this study, she sent a survey to 205 behavior analysts in the state of Massachusetts and asked questions about the kinds of assessments that they use. And noticed that the majority of practitioners that were surveyed believe that functional analysis, the experimental functional analysis, to be the most informative assessment tool for selecting treatment. But even though they believe, yes, that is the most informative assessment tool, only 34% of them actually used an experimental functional analysis to inform the development of a behavior plan. So why is it that people are saying, yes, we understand the experimental functional analysis is the best way for us to identify the function of behavior with some certainty? Well, we're still not using it. So why is it that folks are not using it? So in the study, in the survey, the two of the most reported barriers were people saying that they didn't have time or space to conduct the functional analysis, which, yes, could be an issue. Another reported barrier from the study was lack of a trained staff. And that's something that is easy to debunk, right? Because if you think about the conditions in your functional analysis are very similar or akin to baseline conditions when you're observing the behavior without doing anything, or when similar to treatment conditions, because in the functional analysis, you are delivering reinforcers and you're manipulating antecedents. Don't you do that as a behavior analyst to treat behavior? So if you have the resources to treat behavior, you should have the resources to implement an experimental functional analysis. That's my take on it. That's also, I think, their take on it. Another reported obstacle in the current study was a lack of support or acceptance for functional analysis. So some folks might be concerned that, well, during the functional analysis, you're going to get the behavior to occur and you're going to reinforce the behavior. Isn't that a problem? But I think sometimes it's just a way of communicating what the functional analysis is like and what the purpose is. And you can make an analogy to an allergy test, right? So in the allergy test, you actually receive the different allergens, right? So they have little needles that they poke you with the different allergens to see how you react, right? So if you react to a certain kind of pollen, then you'll be like, oh, well, you're allergic to pollen. So that's very similar to what we do in a functional analysis, right? You expose the participant to the contingencies to see under what conditions would participant react, to under what circumstances would problem behavior occur, just like the allergy test. Under what conditions would you react? Under what allergens would your skin, turn red and itchy? So that's another way of thinking about functional analysis. That's all I have for today. I have no idea how long the lecture was. I didn't really monitor the time, so hopefully it was about 50 minutes. There's lots of resources in the on Canvas. There are the articles I'm going to post. You can just skim through. I'm not going to ask any questions about them. It's just in case that you want to better understand some of the things that I said, that I talked about in this lecture. There definitely the video I talked about last time, which talks about the typical functions of problem behavior or typical functions of behavior. And that's the parent who recorded the kid in the natural environment. There are a couple of training videos in which functional analysis were conducted and were customized based on the problem behavior that they were analyzing. So they had some hypothesis for the reasons why problem behavior was occurring. So they designed some very specific testing conditions, little different from the testing conditions we talked about today. So I'll have all of these, some videos, some articles for you to look through so you can just spend some time. There's also, I'm going to post 2 articles. I think one is already there about different kinds of functional assessments. Actually, it's a video by Dr. Greg Hanley talking about the ISCA assessment. synthesized functional analysis that looks at combinations of variables. So his assumption here is that problem behavior in the natural environment usually is multiply controlled, occurs for a variety of reasons. So his functional analysis combines different testing conditions. It's a pretty cool video. It's a long video, so you don't have time. You don't have to watch it all. But if you're interested in behavior analysis and you're thinking about going into the certificate program or getting a job in the field, or you're already working in the field, that might be a cool talk. He's a great speaker, great work he's been doing, and that's sort of the most current version of functional analysis. There's an article that I'm posting by Claudia Dozier that talks about different ways of graphing and different ways of conducting experimental functional analysis. That's also a really cool article too. It shows you different variations of the functional analysis, not only the 10-minute multi-element, the 5-minute, but there's latency, functional analysis, and other stuff. I'm not going to be asking any questions about this on the exam, but I want you to understand that things are more complicated and more sophisticated than the material presented in the chapter and the things that I talk to you about in class. I just, of course, I'm teaching you the most basic stuff. But if you're curious, there's lots of resources out there. If you're interested, again, post things in the discussion board. Hopefully you're watching the video. If you're watching the video, again, give me some feedback. I've been wondering what to do about my hair. It's growing. I can't go to the barber shop. So one of the things I consider was maybe shaving my head and letting my beard grow. I don't know if you guys think that would be a good look for me. So I would appreciate your suggestions about that too. Anyway, so I'll see you guys next week. Well, actually won't see you next week. You will see me next week. Monday, office hours. Again, there's a waiting room in Zoom. So last Monday, I saw that some of you came in. I saw you on the waiting list. There's no way, I think, for me to send you a message. And then when I finished with the first student, some folks were no longer on the waiting list. So just be patient and wait. I'll get to you eventually. If you want to schedule a time to meet with me, again, shoot me an email. Hopefully everyone is safe and you guys are enjoying those videos. Keep your comments coming, and please be safe. Talk to you guys later.